So I'm going to start with a presentation about the question of and the problems of nanodrug definitions. The background is that we had quite some intense discussions about that issue in the past, and this is also reflected by the question, is an antibody a nanodrug or is it not? So actually Bernd asked me to give a kind of warm-up provocation talk. So why caring at all for the definition of the term nanodrug? Isn't that simply a series of phrases written on a piece of paper? No, I think we should be aware of the fact that this is a very important issue for the entire field of nanomedicine. So a definition has a very powerful meaning. It can exclude or include entire research branches or classes of molecules. Moreover, we should be aware of the fact that the definition is also of quite a big importance for the public perception of the entire field of nanomedicine. So it will grossly define whether this field will be perceived as new, exciting, interesting, and thereby define also the visibility of nanomedicine. It will also have an impact on how the public perceives potentials and dangers of the field of nanomedicine, and finally, of course, thereby shape the public opinion whether it is more in favor or more against nanomedicine. This in turn, as we all know, has an impact on politics, and politics can put either hurdles in the way of nanomedicine or support nanomedicine. And this finally precipitates, and that's where it comes to real life for us, for all of us, in funding programs, because it will define the frequency, the duration, the volume, and the directions of funding programs. There's one example from Germany in the past few years where things went pretty wrong, and that is stem cell research. So the public perception was quite negative regarding this specific research area. Politics accordingly made a number of rules and regulations and laws, putting hurdles into the way of German stem cell research. And this ended up in very limited and very directed funding programs only. So Germany was left behind in that in these past years, and we hope to avoid that this will happen with nanomedicine in the future. Well, of course, the second dimension is research and development and approval. Only a precise definition of a nanodrug would help us to develop certain standards, including basic methods and models. It's a basic precondition for performing modeling and in silico prediction to make predictions on nanodrug behavior. It will provide some possible benchmarks for pharmacology and toxicology, and thereby maybe in long term also indirectly impact approval conditions of nanodrugs. So what is the present nanodrug definition? If you go through the literature, you will frequently find that a nanodrug is defined as a drug that is 100 nanometers or less in size in at least one dimension. So there are several shortcomings with that present definition. And one of these is shown here. According to that definition, aspirin, insulin, or other proteins and antibodies would all be nanodrugs. But we are dealing with such drugs for already more than 3 decades. Well, another problem is shown here. According to that definition, also doxorubicin would be a nanodrug, while doxil, which is often taken as the example or the prototype of a nanodrug, would reside rather at the upper threshold of this limit, or even be beyond that, with a size of, I think it was 100 to 120 nanometers in diameter. Moreover, further disadvantages are that it is commonly thought that a particle size of 50 nanometers or less is required for an efficient passive endothelial transit, and that you require even nanoparticles of 20 nanometers or less in order to have an efficient passive entry into cells. So a nanodrug with a dimension of 100 nanometers, which is defined by having a dimension of a little bit less than 100 nanometers, would not fulfill these properties. Maybe for a few exceptions like nanotubes. And another argument that I would have is that most of the drugs that have been presented in this conference actually are larger than 100 nanometers. At least they are larger than 50 and 20 nanometers. So in science we would say that the present definition is neither sufficient because it doesn't attach anything new to a nanodrug, discerning it from conventional drugs, nor is it necessary, because it doesn't attach a particular property to this group of drugs. So what would be the requirements or the demands for a nanodrug definition? First of all, of course, it needs to emphasize the novel character of nanomedicine and nanodrugs, and needs to separate and discern it from conventional drugs. On the one hand, it should be narrow enough as said, to distinguish it from conventional drugs, but on the other hand, it should still be broad enough to be open for new approaches and not to exclude entire substance classes right from the beginning. And with regard to this, I think we should be aware of the fact that in human disease, at least, we won't come around using biological components in nanodrugs because it's simply too complex. And these biological components will be nucleic acids, lipids, proteins, or antibodies. One potential front-end technology that might be excluded by a very narrow definition is the so-called DNA origami technique. Quite fascinating, and it's pretty well predictable that by this technique you will be also able to make drugs that are substantially larger than 100 nanometers, or you will have drugs that do not work via their particular size, but via nanostructured surfaces. Nonetheless, during biodegradation of such drugs, you will also have nano-sized intermediates, so there are certain properties shared in terms of toxicology and security aspects. So what would be a pragmatic approach for a nanodrug definition? First, let me say what a nanodrug not is. A nanodrug is not a certain substance class, and you will find certainly people disagreeing with that, because if you speak to hardcore nanotechnologists, they would swear on inorganic nanoparticles. Next, a nanodrug is certainly not sufficiently circumscribed simply by the definition of being or having 100 nanometers or less in dimension in at least one of the three dimensions. So I think maybe a good definition of a nanodrug could be that it is a drug whose properties changes upon modulation of size or structure at the nanoscale, or simply a nanodrug is where size matters. So this would fulfill the postulate for a broad definition, being open to take up other fields in the future. On the other hand, one may raise the question, is it narrow enough to be specific for a nanodrug? But maybe we will hear some follow-ups on that also in the next talk, where we will hear about what characterizes a nanodrug. So this brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and I would be happy to receive your questions.